December 17, 1944. The Ardennes. Somewhere in the forest between Losheim and Bullingen, in a temperature that is well below freezing, in snow that has been falling for 2 days. If you were a Volksgrenadier in the German offensive in the West that winter, you were, on paper, a soldier of the greatest army in Europe. In practice, you were cold in a way that most people alive today have never experienced and cannot imagine. You were wearing a wool greatcoat that had been wet for 3 days and was now partly frozen. Your boots had leaked since November. You had not felt your toes since the day before yesterday. You had eaten in the last 36 hours some bread and a little sausage, and you had been told before the attack that there would be food ahead. That was not encouragement. That was a plan. The German offensive in the Ardennes was built at the highest level on the assumption that its soldiers would eat the enemy's food and burn the enemy's fuel. And on the second day, in a wood outside a village, your section overran an American position and found what the Americans had left behind. And you went through a pack. Now, you have done this before. You have been in this war a long time, and you have gone through a lot of dead men's kit, and you know what to expect. You expect food, and you take it. You expect cigarettes, and you take those too. What is in the Americans' pack is this. There is food. There is more food than a German soldier would carry for a week. There is a small waxed cardboard box with a complete meal inside it, hermetically sealed. A tin of meat, a biscuit, a fruit bar, a packet of powdered coffee, sugar, chewing gum, 4 cigarettes, and a small square of toilet paper. There are more of these boxes. There is a chocolate bar in an olive drab wrapper. There is a first aid pouch. Inside it, a sterile field dressing and a packet of white powder. There is a small tin of powder that you do not recognize at all. And there is a pair of socks. Clean, dry, wool, folded. And you stand there, in the snow, in the Ardennes, with your feet rotting inside your boots, holding a dead man's clean, dry socks in your hand, and you cannot make it mean anything. Because a soldier does not carry spare socks. A soldier carries ammunition, and food, and whatever he needs to kill the enemy, and everything else is weight, and weight kills you. That is what the German army taught. That is what every army in Europe had always taught. And here is an American infantryman, in the middle of a war, carrying laundry. The conclusion a German soldier reaches is immediate, and it is the same conclusion the whole German army reached about the Americans, from the generals down. They are soft, they are pampered. Their army carries socks and chocolate and toilet paper. They are shopkeepers playing at soldiers, and they cannot possibly endure what we have endured. And that conclusion is completely, catastrophically wrong, because here is the figure that should have ended the argument, and no German soldier standing in that wood could possibly have known it. Over the course of the war, one chocolate company in Pennsylvania, one company in one American state, manufactured something on the order of 3 billion chocolate bars for the United States military. 3 billion. That is not a supply. That is not a ration. That is an industrial civilization deciding, as a matter of policy, that every single one of its soldiers, everywhere on Earth, at all times, would have 600 calories in his pocket in case everything else went wrong. And the socks were not laundry. The socks were a weapon. They were one of the most carefully considered, hardest fought, most expensive weapons of the entire war. And they were in that pack because the United States Army had discovered, at appalling cost, exactly what happens to an army whose men cannot keep their feet dry. This is not a story about food, or about clothing, or about who was tougher. This is a forensic audit of 2 completely different theories about what a soldier is. One army believed that a soldier's job was to endure hardship. The other army believed that hardship was a supply failure, and that supply failures can be fixed. Only one of those armies was right. Part 1. The German Calculus. Let us begin by being fair, because this story is worthless if you think the Germans were fools about cold weather. They were not. They had learned. God had they learned. In the winter of 1941, outside Moscow, the German army had walked into the Russian winter in summer uniforms. The reasons for that catastrophe are argued about to this day. Arrogance, a campaign that was supposed to be over in 3 months, a supply system that had put ammunition ahead of overcoats. Whatever the cause, the result was one of the great preventable disasters in military history. German soldiers froze to death in their thousands. Frostbite casualties ran to well over 100,000 men. The Wehrmacht held its line outside Moscow and lost more men to the temperature than to the Red Army. And Germany learned. By 1943, the German army had developed genuinely excellent cold weather equipment. The reversible padded winter suit, white on one side for snow, field gray or camouflage on the other, was, as a piece of design, arguably superior to anything the Americans had. Felt overboots, padded trousers, fur caps, a whole system of clothing built by people who had watched their friends die of the cold and had gone away and thought very hard about it. The German winter kit of 1944 was good. There simply was not enough of it. And this is the point at which every single one of these stories arrives, and it arrives from a different direction every time, and it is always the same destination. Germany could design anything. Germany could not deliver it. The winter suits existed. They existed in the depots, in the warehouses, in the requisition forms. Getting them to a Volksgrenadier standing in a wood in the Ardennes in December of 1944 required trains, and the trains needed track, and the track had been bombed. It required trucks, and the trucks needed fuel, and there was no fuel. It required daylight, and daylight belonged to the Americans. So some units in the Ardennes were well equipped, and some units were not. And which one you were in was a lottery, and if you lost the lottery you stood in the snow in a wet greatcoat and you did not complain, because complaining was not a thing a German soldier did. And that brings us to the food. But before we get to the ration scale, look at who was actually standing in that wood. The Volksgrenadier divisions that made the Ardennes attack were not the German army of 1940. They were what was left. They were built out of surplus Luftwaffe ground crew who no longer had aircraft to service, out of naval personnel who no longer had ships, out of men combed out of factories, out of the very young and the not very young, out of veterans of the Eastern Front with 3 wounds and a nervous system in ruins. They were given a few weeks of training, a rifle, and a place in the line. Some of them were superb. German training, even in its dying months, was startlingly good, and Volksgrenadier units in the Ardennes fought with a ferocity that shocked the Americans facing them. But these were not men with reserves in the tank. These were men who had been used up already, and who were being asked to attack, through deep snow, in the worst winter in years, on very little food, against an army that was warm. And the German command knew exactly what it was asking. That is the part that does not get said. The plan was to reach Antwerp. Antwerp is roughly 200 kilometers from the start line. The offensive was launched with fuel for a fraction of that distance, and rations that assumed capture. Everything, the fuel, the food, the momentum, depended on taking American supplies within the first 48 hours. It was not a plan to defeat the Americans. It was a plan to eat them. And now, the ration scale. The official German ration scale for a frontline soldier was, on paper, adequate. It was calculated. It was thought about. Bread, meat, fat, sugar, coffee substitute, a tobacco ration. What was actually delivered, by the winter of 1944, bore very little relationship to what was written down. Because the same collapse that stopped the winter clothing stopped the food. No fuel, no trucks. No track, no trains. No sky, no daylight movement. And the German army in the West, in the winter of 1944, was, in very large sections, simply hungry. Not starving. Hungry, which is worse than it sounds, because a hungry man is a cold man, and a cold man cannot think, and a soldier who cannot think dies. And now we get to the part of this that is not about logistics at all. It is about philosophy, and it is, I think, the deepest thing in this entire story. The German army had a theory about the soldier, and the theory was hardness. The soldier endures. He does not complain. He is not comfortable, and he does not expect to be comfortable. Hunger is to be borne. Cold is to be borne. Exhaustion is to be borne. The finest German soldier was the one who could absorb the most punishment without breaking, and German military culture, which produced, let us be honest, some of the toughest and most tactically effective infantry in the history of warfare, genuinely believed that this hardness was a source of strength. and it is a source of strength, up to a point. But hardness is not a substitute for calories. A frozen foot does not care how brave you are. A man with trench foot cannot walk, and a man who cannot walk cannot fight. And it does not matter in the slightest that he was willing to endure it. Willingness is not the variable. Tissue is the variable. The German army treated deprivation as a test of character. And a test of character is a wonderful thing, right up until the moment when it becomes a way of not noticing that your supply system has collapsed. That is the German calculus. Excellent winter equipment that did not arrive. A ration scale on paper that bore no relationship to the food in the man's hand. A supply system with no fuel, no track, and no sky. And underneath all of it, a military culture that had convinced itself that a hungry, freezing soldier who did not complain was demonstrating strength, rather than demonstrating a catastrophic institutional failure that nobody was allowed to name. Now let us look at what was in the Americans' pack and why. Part 2. The American Answer. Everything in that pack was designed by somebody. I want to be precise about that because it is the whole point. Nothing in there was traditional. Nothing was there because it had always been there. Every single item in an American infantryman's kit in 1944 had been argued over, tested, costed, and specified by an organization whose entire job was to think about it. Start with the food. The United States Army ran a research laboratory in Chicago, whose purpose was the scientific study of what a soldier should eat. Not what was available, not what was traditional, what a man carrying 60 pounds of equipment, in combat, in the cold, actually requires in order to keep functioning. It was staffed by nutritionists and physiologists, including a scientist named Ansel Keys, who would go on to become one of the most famous nutritional researchers of the 20th century, and whose name is commonly attached to the ration he helped develop. The K-ration, a complete day's food in 3 small waxed boxes, designed to be carried in a pocket, designed to survive being rained on, designed around a calorie count calculated by scientists for a man who is fighting. And it contained, in every single box, cigarettes and chewing gum and toilet paper, because the men who designed it understood something that the German army never seriously engaged with. That morale is not a soft thing. That a man who can smoke a cigarette and clean himself is a man who is still a person, and a man who is still a person will fight, and a man who has stopped being a person will not. Now the chocolate bar. And this is my favorite object in the entire war. The D ration bar. Field ration D. An emergency ration, a survival item, to be eaten only when there was nothing else. The Army gave the Hershey Company a specification, and the specification contained 4 requirements. It had to weigh 4 ounces. It had to be high in food energy. It had to survive high temperatures without melting. And it had to taste, in the words that have come down to us, only a little better than a boiled potato. Read that again. The United States Army specified that its emergency chocolate bar must taste bad. Deliberately. On purpose. Because if it tasted good, soldiers would eat it as a snack, and then it would not be there on the day they were cut off in a wood, with no food, and needed 600 calories to stay alive. That is not a chocolate bar. That is an act of institutional psychology. Somebody in an office in Washington sat down and thought carefully about how a 19-year-old behaves when he is bored and hungry and has a chocolate bar in his pocket, and then engineered the chocolate bar to defeat him. It was, by universal agreement of everybody who ever ate one, revolting. Soldiers hated it, they complained about it constantly. It kept an enormous number of them alive. Now the clothing. The American winter uniform system was based on an idea that sounds obvious now and was not obvious then: layering. Wool underwear, a wool shirt, a wool sweater, a field jacket with a removable liner, an outer shell. The M1943 field jacket was the centerpiece, a modular system where a man could add or remove layers according to the temperature and the work he was doing. Because here is the thing about cold that every mountaineer knows, and most armies had to learn the hard way. The enemy is not cold. The enemy is sweat. A man in a heavy coat marching hard gets wet from the inside, and then he stops moving, and then the wet freezes, and then he dies. You cannot fix that with a warmer coat. You can only fix it with layers he can take off. Now stop for a moment and look at what kind of organization produces a decision like that. Somebody, in an office, in peacetime, sat down and thought about the thermodynamics of a human body doing manual labor in the cold. Somebody ran tests. Somebody put men in a cold chamber and measured them. Somebody argued about wool weights and moisture transport and the number of buttons on a liner. And then somebody costed it, and specified it, and contracted it, and a textile mill in Massachusetts made 10 million of them. None of those people ever saw a German. Not one of them will appear in a single history book you have ever read. They are the reason the American infantryman in the Ardennes could still hold a rifle. And the same is true of the little pouch on his belt. Inside it was a sterile field dressing, sealed in a waterproof packet, because the Quartermaster Corps had worked out that a dressing which has been rained on is not a dressing, it is an infection. And sulfanilamide powder, so that the man himself, or the man next to him, could get an antibacterial agent into the wound in the first minute, rather than the first hour. Not a doctor, not a medic. The man himself. The American Army had pushed medicine all the way down to the individual soldier, and it had done that because somebody in an office had asked the question, what is the earliest possible moment at which this intervention can happen? Over and over, across every single item in that pack, the same institutional mind is at work, asking the same question in different forms. What is the actual problem? When does it start? What is the earliest we can intervene? What will it cost to give this to every man, everywhere, forever? Fine, do it. That is not softness. That is the most ruthless thing in this entire story, and the German soldier holding the pack could not see it, because it did not look like war. And finally, the socks. The little tin of powder that the German did not recognize was foot powder. And the socks were not laundry. And to understand why they were in that pack, we have to talk about what happened to the American Army in the autumn of 1944. And it is not a story that flatters anybody. It nearly destroyed them. Part 3. The River of Steel. Let us do the numbers first, because they are absurd. And then let us do the disaster, because it is more important. The Hershey Company, in Pennsylvania, produced something on the order of 3 billion ration bars for the American military during the war. At peak, that plant was turning out these things by the millions per week. K rations were manufactured in the hundreds of millions. In 1944 alone, American industry produced well over 100 million of them. American wool consumption for military clothing ran into hundreds of millions of pounds. The Quartermaster Corps was, by 1944, one of the largest purchasers of textiles on the planet. An American soldier in Europe was being clothed, fed, medicated, and equipped by a supply operation that had no precedent and, arguably, has had no equal since. And in the autumn of 1944, that supply operation failed. Here is what happened. The armies broke out of Normandy and ran east faster than anyone had planned. Supply became a crisis. We have covered this. The Red Ball Express ran day and night. And when you have finite trucks and infinite demand, somebody has to decide what goes on the truck. And the decision, made by men who were not stupid and who were trying to win a war, was ammunition, fuel, food. Winter clothing went to the bottom of the list. Overshoes, shoe packs, spare boots, winter uniforms, and the tens of millions of pairs of woolen socks that the American war economy had already manufactured and shipped, sat in depots in Normandy while the trucks carried shells. And then the winter came, and it was one of the worst winters in living memory. And American soldiers in flooded foxholes in the Hurtgen Forest and the Vosges and the Ardennes, standing for days in freezing water in leather boots that soaked through in an hour, began to lose their feet. Trench foot, immersion foot, the tissue of the foot, kept cold and wet for long enough, simply begins to die. In the worst cases, it goes gangrenous. In the worst cases, they take the foot off. And I want you to understand what this actually is, because the name makes it sound like a rash. It is not a rash. A man stands in a foxhole with 6 inches of freezing water in the bottom of it. He cannot leave. There are Germans 400 yards away. He stands there for a day, then another day, then a third. The cold constricts the blood vessels in his feet. The blood stops reaching the tissue. The nerves go first. And this is the cruelest part, because when the pain stops, the man thinks he is getting better. He is not. He is losing the feeling because the nerve is dying. Then he is pulled out of the line, and his feet warm up, and the blood comes back, and that is when the pain arrives. Men who had been through artillery bombardments, who had been wounded, who had seen the worst things a human being can see, described the pain of rewarming trench-footed feet as the worst thing that ever happened to them. They screamed. Grown men, who had not screamed under shell fire, screamed in a warm tent. And then the surgeon looked at the feet, and sometimes the feet were black. The American army in Europe lost something in the region of 45,000 men to cold injury in that winter. 45,000. That is not a statistic. That is the fighting strength of several divisions. That is more men than were lost in some entire campaigns. Taken out of the line, in the middle of the decisive winter of the war in the West, without a single German firing a shot at them. Some of them never walked properly again. Some of them lost the foot. The American supply system had failed. Completely, catastrophically. And it had failed for exactly the same reason that a German supply system fails. Because somebody had to prioritize, and boots came behind bullets. Now, here is the difference, and it is the only difference, and it is everything. The Americans found out, and they fixed it. Command took hold of it. Eisenhower and the Army group commanders made cold injury a command responsibility, meaning that if your men got trench foot, that was your failure as an officer, and it would be on your record. Foot discipline became a direct order. Men were required to take their boots off, dry their feet, massage them, apply powder, and put on dry socks, every day, in a foxhole, under fire, in the dark. And to make that possible, the United States Army did something that sounds trivial, and is not. It reclassified dry socks as a combat supply item. Socks went forward with the ammunition. Clean dry socks were pushed up to the front line in sandbags on the same jeeps and the same trucks that carried the shells, and the men on the line rotated their wet pairs back to be dried and reissued. Some units carried the spare pair inside their shirt, against the body, so it would stay dry and warm. That is the pair of socks in the pack. That is not softness. That is not luxury. That is an army that lost 45,000 men to a preventable injury, went back and examined its own failure with total ruthlessness, identified the intervention, and then reorganized its entire forward supply chain around delivering a woolen object to a man in a hole in the ground. And the rate of cold injury collapsed. Look at the shape of it. Look at the shape of it against everything else in this series. Patton ran out of fuel on the Muse, a distribution failure, and they fixed it in weeks. American winter clothing failed in the autumn of 1944, a distribution failure, and they fixed it. The Sherman was outgunned by the Panther, a design failure, and they built a system to recover and repair and out-attend it. The American war is not a story of a country that did everything right. It is a story of a country that failed constantly, publicly, expensively, and had the industrial depth and the institutional honesty to go back, find the failure, and crush it with resources. The German army in 1944 had exactly the same failures, and it could not fix a single one of them. There was no reserve, there was no depth, there was no sock sitting in a warehouse in Antwerp waiting for a truck. There was no truck, there was no fuel for the truck. And there was no institutional culture that would permit an officer to write down, on paper, that his men were freezing because the system had broken. Because in the German army of 1944, a report like that was not a supply document. It was a confession of defeatism, and there were places you went for that. So the German soldier stood in the snow and endured and said nothing, and the American soldier changed his socks. Part 4. The German realization. The Germans knew the American kit was better. Everybody knew. Captured American equipment was prized throughout the German army with an enthusiasm that verges on the comic. American boots, American rations, American cigarettes above all. German soldiers would trade almost anything for American cigarettes. American medical supplies, American vehicles, as we have seen. And in the Ardennes, in December of 1944, it went from being a preference to being an operational plan. The offensive assumed capture. It assumed that German troops would take American fuel dumps and American supply depots and American ration stores, because there was not enough German fuel and not enough German food to sustain the advance otherwise. Think about what that means, morally and psychologically, for the men doing it. You are attacking, in the snow, at enormous cost, and you have been told that the food you will eat tomorrow is currently in the possession of the men you are about to kill. And they took the depots. In some places, they took enormous quantities. There are accounts, a great many accounts, of German troops in the Ardennes stopping in the middle of an attack to eat American rations, to loot American supply dumps, to fill their pockets with American chocolate and American cigarettes. German officers were furious about it. It slowed the advance. It broke the tempo. It was, in the strict military sense, an indiscipline. But you cannot be angry at a starving man for eating. And here is the realization, and it is not the one that the German soldier reached in the wood. He looked in that pack, and he saw softness. He saw a spoiled army. He saw shopkeepers. He was looking at the wrong thing entirely. Every single item in that pack was a decision. The calorie count was calculated by a scientist. The chocolate was engineered to taste bad so that he would still have it on the worst day of his life. The layers were designed because sweat kills. The powder was in the tin because 45,000 men had already lost their feet, and somebody had gone back and worked out why. The socks were there because an army had examined its own catastrophic failure without flinching, and had then rebuilt its supply chain around a pair of woolen socks. That pack was not evidence of a soft nation. That pack was evidence of a nation that had decided, at the very highest level, that the endurance of its soldiers was not an infinite resource to be drawn on. The German army said, "This man will endure." The American army said, "Why is this man having to endure? Who is responsible? Fix it." And that difference, that single, unglamorous, bureaucratic difference, is worth more divisions than any general in the war ever commanded. The German soldier standing in the snow with the socks in his hand was holding the answer. He threw them away. Most of them did. There are accounts of German soldiers taking the food and the cigarettes and discarding the rest, because the rest did not look like war. He was cold. He was hungry. He was by any measure a brave man in an appalling situation, and he could not see it. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Quartermaster Corps, as a supply sergeant, in a depot company, driving rations forward, or if your grandmother spent 1943 in a factory packing K-rations, or wrapping chocolate bars, or knitting for the war, I would be grateful to hear their name and their unit in the comments. None of them were decorated. Nobody made a film about them. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war is ending. The accounting begins. And the accounting, when it comes, says something that nobody in 1939 would have predicted, and that almost nobody has properly absorbed since. The German soldier of the Second World War was, man for man, one of the toughest and most tactically capable infantrymen ever produced by any nation. That is not propaganda. It is the consistent verdict of the Allied officers who fought him, and they were not inclined to be generous about it. He endured things that are difficult to read about. He fought on, in appalling conditions, on almost nothing, for years, long after any rational assessment said it was over. And it did not matter. It did not matter, because endurance is a resource, and like every other resource, it can be spent, and once it is spent, there is no more of it, and no amount of courage will manufacture another liter of it. You cannot endure your way out of frostbite. You cannot be brave at a calorie deficit. A man whose feet have rotted cannot hold a line, and the German army in 1944 and 45 was an army of magnificent soldiers who were being slowly, methodically taken apart by cold and hunger and exhaustion, and whose entire military culture forbade them from calling that what it was. The American soldier was not tougher. He would have told you so himself, loudly, and he complained about everything, constantly, in a way that German officers found genuinely baffling and rather contemptible. And that complaining, that endless, undisciplined, un-Prussian griping about the food and the cold and the mud was, in its own strange way, a symptom of the thing that won. Because in the American army, when a soldier complained that his feet were wet, it went up the chain, and somewhere at the top of that chain, there was a man whose job it was to do something about it, and he had a factory, and the factory made socks. The German army treated hardship as a virtue to be borne. The American army treated hardship as a supply failure to be fixed. And one of those is a philosophy, and the other one is a system, and over 4 years, across a continent, a system beats a philosophy every single time. They could have known. That is the thing that stays with me. It was in his hand. A German soldier stood in a wood in the Ardennes in December of 1944, freezing, starving, holding a dead American's clean, dry socks, and he was holding, in that moment, the entire answer to the question of why he was going to lose. And he could not read it, because it did not look like a weapon. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the ordinary, invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won. And remember this about the men who filled the packs. Nobody made a film about a supply sergeant. There is no monument to the man who drove a jeep full of sandbags stuffed with dry socks up a shelled road in December of 1944, to a company holding a tree line in the Ardennes, so that 80 men could take their boots off in a hole in the ground and keep their feet. He was not trying to be a hero. He was trying to make sure that when the sun came up, those men could still walk. Mostly, they could. They deserved to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the work they did, carrying, packing, driving, and delivering the least glamorous cargo of the entire war, to men who never knew their names, and who came home on their own 2 feet because of it.